우선 오늘 웨비나에 대해서 간단하게 어떻게 진행될 건지 말씀드리고 카산드라 브룩스 교수님께서 어떤 분이신지 간단하게 소개드리고 나서 웨비나를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 우선 제가 간단하게 소개를 드리고 브룩스 교수님께서 강연을 주신 다음에 간단하게 Q&A 세션이 있을 예정이니 질문이 있으신 분들께서는 이제 Q&A 세션 때 직접 질문을 주셔도 되고 아니면 사실 편의상 저희 그 밑에 메시지 창에다가 질문을 미리 올려주시면 정말 감사드리겠습니다. 시간 관계상 모든 질문에 다 답변을 여기서 해드릴 수 없는 점은 양해 부탁드립니다. 자, 그러면 브룩스 교수님에 대해서 간단하게 소개를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 저희 카산드라 브룩스 교수님께서는 University of Colorado Boulder에서 조교수로 계시고요. 로스해가 2015년도에 MPA로 그 해양보전구역으로 지정이 되었다고 널리 알려져 있는데 그동안 굉장히 많은 공여를 들이신 박사님으로 정말 유명하시고 많은 저희 해양 보존을 위해 노력을 해주시는 분입니다. 특히 이제 해양과학, 환경정책 그리고 공공봉사 활동의 교차점에서 일을 하고 계신데요. 2016년도 로스 MP 잘못 전달해드렸. 그 대중봉사 활동의 교차점으로 일을 하고 계시는데요. 특히 지난 15년 동안 남극 대륙 보호에 집중을 하면서 남극 대륙에 대한 뜨거운 열정을 가지고 계신 분입니다. 네, 카산드라 브룩스님께서 열심히 일하시고 계신 이 분야는 특히 2016년도에 이제 결성됐던 로스의 MPA 같은 경우에는 현재 지구상 가장 건강한 해양 생태계 중 하나로 굉장히 중요한 해양 보존구역으로 있는데 앞으로도 많은 해양 보존 구역들이 달성될 수 있게 많은 그 후대에 environmentalist 환경 보호가들을 많이 생성을 하기 위해 교수님으로 지금 계시고 있습니다. 그러면 이제 웨비나를 진행을 하도록 할 텐데요. 큰 박수와 환영으로 카산드라 브룩스님을 모셔보겠습니다. 가능하시면 그 웹캠을 켜주시면 감사하겠고요. 그리고 하나 더 저희 웨비나에서는 동시 통역이 진행이 되는데 밑에 보시면 동시 통역 혹은 interpretation 칸이 있습니다. 거기서 이제 눌러주시면 한국어 혹은 영어로 이렇게 되어 있어서 편하신 언어로 그냥 선택을 해서 들으시면 되겠습니다. 자, 그러면 이제 카산드라 브룩스 교수님을 모시도록 하겠습니다. 환영의 박수 부탁드립니다.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here with you today. Can everybody see my screen okay? It's okay? Okay, great. Wonderful. So I do want to tell you a story about how we protected the Ross Sea, Antarctica. But before I do that, I'd like to take you to Antarctica, at least with pictures and stories. And here it is, Antarctica, this icy continent at the bottom of the world. And I want you to know that before the continent was ever discovered, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north. Without it, they said, the entire earth would topple over. And I love this metaphor because the Greeks were actually right. Because since its discovery, scientists have documented that Antarctica stores 90% of the Earth's freshwater. It regulates our global climate and drives global ocean circulation. And despite its harsh conditions, despite its freezing conditions, Antarctic waters actually teem with life. And the Antarctic actually contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems left in the entire world. To illustrate that, this is a map of a study in Science that came out in 2008 that assessed global impacts on marine ecosystems. And the spectrum is from red to blue, with red being our most damaged marine ecosystems and blue being our most intact or most pristine and healthy ecosystems. And you can see in this figure that the only areas that are left that are blue are those in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And in fact, this study actually highlighted the Ross Sea in particular to be the healthiest marine ecosystem left in the world. And I'll get more to that in a minute. So why does Antarctica have these healthy marine ecosystems? Well, part of it is that Antarctica is incredibly remote. It's really far away. And we also have this shield of ice that forms around Antarctica every winter. And that's the picture in front of you. It's showing Antarctica in the winter versus the summer, and this massive ice that can act as a barrier for people going there. But it hasn't just been protected by ice and remoteness. It's also protected by political will. In Antarctica, we have this amazing framework for international collaboration through science, in that even if countries are fighting or there's diplomatic tensions, we put those aside in Antarctica, and scientists will work side by side despite tensions. And so I want to highlight in particular the scientific collaboration of the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, which led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. And you can see in front of you is all the original signatories of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. The treaty is absolutely amazing. It sets aside the entire Antarctic continent for the sake of peace and science. And the Antarctic Treaty System, which is the treaty and other agreements that are part of it, actually grant freedom of science in Antarctica. It prohibits military operations. It prohibits nuclear activities, suspends sovereignty, and bans mining. So it truly is this amazing agreement that we've really set aside Antarctica for the sake of global humanity. Today, there's actually 53 signatories to the Antarctic Treaty, and the treaty system governs the land and the sea. It really is about peace, science, and environmental protection, and it is in place indefinitely. And just to share with you that South Korea joined the Antarctic Treaty in 1986, so it's been a member for a very long time. And I just can't highlight enough how amazing this agreement is. I don't know anywhere else in the world that that countries have put their differences aside and taken this very large space and basically created a shared commons. The Antarctic continent acts as a de facto world park, and it really is, from my perspective, one of our greatest achievements. So under the Antarctic Treaty System is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or the acronym is CAMLR. And in line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, CAMLR is actually considered a leader in marine resource management. They're responsible for all the marine life in the waters around Antarctica. They currently have 27 member states, and all decisions are made by consensus. And you need actually unanimous consensus. Every country has to agree for decisions to be made in CAMLR. So as I mentioned, they're considered a leader in marine resource management, and part of that is that their convention is really grounded in this precautionary, science-based, and ecosystem approach where fishing is allowed, but there are very strict rules around fishing, that they have to have information on the fishery. You have to consider all the predators and the prey in the system in order for fishing to occur. Very much an ecosystem-based management approach that happens there. So there are two main fisheries in the Southern Ocean. One is for krill, and krill is the key prey species in the Southern Ocean food web. So many Antarctic life feeds on and depends on krill, the penguins, the whales, the seals. So it is that keystone species in the ecosystem, incredibly important. And it is largely fished actually for fish meal, for aquaculture and livestock, and also for omega-3 pills. So for the most part, people don't actually eat the krill fishery. It's a very large fishery. It's growing over 400,000 tons a year, and it's growing more every year, in part because of the rise in demand for omega-3 pills and for fish meal. The other main fishery is for Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish. So where krill are the key prey species, Antarctic toothfish are the top predator species. You can see from these pictures just how very large they get. And there are no sharks in Antarctica. So many people think of the toothfish as the shark of Antarctica, where it's very large, it's a top predator, and very important in the food system. It is an extraordinary fish too, especially the Antarctic toothfish. It actually has antifreeze in its blood, which keeps its blood from freezing in the frozen Southern Ocean. And it's not just an important predator, it's actually a really important prey species for Weddell seals, as you can see in this picture, but also for other whales. So there's the main fishery for toothfish actually sells toothfish as Chilean sea bass, at least that's what we call it here, here in the United States. And it's not a sea bass, they're from Chile, but that is the market name we call it. It's also known as white gold because it is so incredibly valuable. And there is a very large international market for this fish here in the United States, as well as in Asia and in Europe. And there is increasing pressure to fish this animal because it is so high value and so popular in restaurants. And toothfish is actually how I first fell in love with Antarctica. Is I came into a graduate studies of having to study the life history of Antarctic toothfish in the Ross Sea. We were studying how old do the fish get? When do they mature? Where do they move throughout their life? And I was so incredibly grateful to come into this project. I was looking for a fisheries project and was asked to join this one. And I got to actually go to Antarctica and meet the fish in person. And it is a very beautiful fish, as you can see. I think it's beautiful. And the thing, though, that struck me immediately when I went to Antarctica is this absolutely beautiful place. No people live there. It is very icy place, is very treacherous place, very big oceans, big waves, big wind, very dangerous place to actually be fishing. And it struck me immediately that I could not believe that we were sending fishing vessels to Antarctica. It's so far away. The Ross Sea in particular is the most remote part of the ocean in the entire world. And these are just a couple pictures of those fishing vessels in the ice, just to give you a sense of the incredible conditions that fishermen are working in. And I was very surprised that we were fishing in Antarctica. But the reason for it is that we really have fished our oceans to the brink, where this figure illustrates this well for you, where by 2008, 90% of our global fisheries were either collapsed, overexploited, or fully exploited. And this graphic is showing you that those numbers in brown and red and yellow are all the species that are collapsed, overexploited, or fully exploited. Whereas areas in blue are those fisheries that are undeveloped, green is developing. We have very few places left in the world where we still have developing fisheries. And so Antarctica was one of these last places that, as the rest of the world's oceans were overexploited, we ended up moving further and further away into deeper waters, eventually reaching places like the Ross Sea. So it very much is in line with global fishing trends. This map just gives you a sense of all the different countries and places being fished in the Southern Ocean. You can see the Antarctic continent, and the black line around it is the CAMLAR area that they manage. And each flag on that map in front of you is a vessel from that country that notified to fish. So you can really get a sense of how busy Antarctica is becoming with fisheries. And if you can see my mouse, the area here around the Antarctic Peninsula is where most of the krill fishing is. So that's why you're seeing so many flags there. And then here in the Ross Sea is where some of the large toothfish fisheries are, as well as toothfish fisheries here around some of the subantarctic islands. So becoming a very busy place with fishing, and more so every year, more and more demand here. So on top of increasing fishing pressure, Antarctica is under dramatic climate change, and you probably hear about it if you follow the news at all. We're constantly hearing about parts of Antarctica melting and ice shelves collapsing and glaciers retreating. And this figure tries to summarize for you those trends. It is very complicated, and there's a lot of variability and uncertainty around these trends, but we do know the peninsula in particular is warming rapidly. So the areas in red are areas that are warming, where we have ice shelves collapsing and glaciers retreating, sea ice reductions. And areas in blue are areas that are actually cooling right now. Like, that has been the trend, although I've heard in recent years that is changing as well. So just to paint the picture that it's complicated, lots of changes happening to the Antarctic continent, to the waters around it. And so the system is very much struggling to adapt to climate change. And there are dramatic ecosystem impacts because of this. We're seeing decreases in plankton. We're seeing potential decreases in Antarctic krill, which again, the whole system depends on. We're seeing some declines in penguin populations, and a lot of these trends we don't understand yet, but certainly they are probably related to environmental change from climate change. So I've told you a few things I just want to summarize right now, that Antarctica is home to some of the last healthy marine ecosystems left on the planet. I've told you that CAMLR is a leader in international ocean management. And I've told you there's increasing pressure to fish in the Southern Ocean. So there's this ongoing challenge for CAMLR to navigate. How do we deal with this tension? How do we conserve the Southern Ocean ecosystem, but also allow for developing fisheries? So marine protected areas are this increasingly valuable management tool for doing just that. It's the definition of a marine protected area is an area where human activities are restricted to meet specific conservation, protection, or fisheries management objectives. And so it is this tool for both conserving marine biodiversity, but potentially enhancing fisheries as well. And this map in front of you just tries to summarize all the protected areas that we have currently on the planet. So about 8.16% of the ocean is protected currently. And global targets are calling for between 10 to 30%. So we're not quite at those global targets yet. And I just want to give you a sense of why protected areas are becoming more popular. So this is a really nice graphic that tries to, summarize that for you. Where on the left, you have the unprotected area where fishing is allowed, and you can see there's a lot less fish that live there. There's a lot less diversity, so different species of animals. The fish tend to be smaller, whereas you can see here in the marine protected area that's close to fishing, you have a lot more life living there, so a lot more biomass, the sheer amount of life living there, and you have a lot more diversity of animals that live there as well. And one of the really cool things about a protected area is that, as this illustrates, you have these big fish that grow really big in the protected area. They have babies in the protected area, and then they actually swim out into the area where they can be fished. And so for people who are still actively fishing, marine protected areas can be a great thing for actually allowing all the life to recover and spill over into these areas where they can then be fished. Another really important thing, especially in the context of the Southern Ocean, is that marine protected areas enhance resilience. So they actually maintain all the different trophic levels of the ecosystem, and they increase species and genetic diversity, which actually enhances resilience to environmental change, including climate change. So that is part of why we're pushing for them in the Southern Ocean. Now, CAMLR, in line with their leadership, they've actually been working towards marine protected areas since 2002. There was a global call through the World Summit on Sustainable Development for the whole world to have a network of protected areas by 2012. We haven't met that goal yet, but the timeline on it keeps being changed, where now the new goal is 2030. But CAMLR committed to this goal back in 2002, which is really amazing. And they adopted the world's first international marine protected area in 2009. That was their first MPA. So I now want to take you to the Ross Sea. So in CAMLR's process of talking about marine protected areas, the Ross Sea actually was a priority area. And the reason for that is back to this map I showed you earlier. In this assessment, it was determined to be the healthiest large marine ecosystem left on the entire planet, which is amazing. And then it also is the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean. This is actually a photo from NASA of the phytoplankton bloom in the Ross Sea that happens every summer. So massive productivity in this place, most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean. And because of that, it has this disproportionate amount of marine life, where you have more Adelie penguins and emperor penguins and Weddell seals than other parts of Antarctica. So I have to also tell you about this person in front of you on the screen. His name is Dr. David Ainley. He's an Antarctic marine ecologist from California, and he'd been working in the Ross Sea for decades. And the reason he liked working in the Ross Sea in particular is because he felt it was a place you could go and study a healthy system. And he always said, you know, from a marine perspective, how could I, it's like a doctor. If you don't have a healthy patient, you don't actually understand what's happening in the sick patient. And so he always said the Ross Sea is like having that healthy system that then helps you understand all the other systems and how to help them recover. And he'd been working there for decades when he saw the first fishing vessel come into the Ross Sea and start taking out Antarctic toothfish. And that was happening in the late 1990s. And he began advocating to protect the Ross Sea, saying we have to have this one place where we choose not to fish, that we leave intact and healthy. And so in 2002, between 2002 and 2004, he began writing scientific papers to CAMLR, making a case for, you can see the title, it says base datum of normality. Basically, we need this baseline of what a healthy marine ecosystem is. We need to protect this place. His very obscure papers actually ended up in the hands of Boulder-based conservation photographer John Weller, who you see in front of you. John was a photographer based here in Boulder, Colorado, where I am, and he had been using photography locally in Colorado for conservation and protection initiatives. And when he read this paper, he was so compelled that he could not believe that we had damaged the ocean so much that this one place was left in Antarctica. And he actually flew out and met with David Ainley, and they agreed to tell the story of the Ross Sea, that David would galvanize the scientists and John would be the media, be the storyteller about this place and bring the Ross Sea to the public. So they worked together to brand the Ross Sea as the last ocean, to get in people's minds, here's this last place that's left in the world that we can all come together to protect. John recruited New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young to come to Antarctica with him and to make a documentary film. And at the time, as I mentioned to you, I started my work in Antarctica studying Antarctic toothfish in the Ross Sea. And so I was one of the few people that was actually studying toothfish. Very few people actually study it. So John actually found me. He said, we need to talk about toothfish and this growing fishery. And he convinced me to join his Last Ocean project and to actually then basically dedicate the next many years of my life to working alongside him. He later convinced me to marry him, to have his children, and to move to Boulder, Colorado, where I am now, and stay here. So we worked on this amazing journey together. We produced a flood of science, largely led by David Ainley, in support of protecting the Ross Sea. We bombarded the world with media. So working alongside so many partners, including some of you here today, working all over the world with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition and all of their partners, creating lots of media and photography, bringing the Ross Sea to life for people. Peter Young made this award-winning documentary that was shown all over the world, including outside the doors of CAMLR. John produced a photography book, which he actually hand-delivered signed copies to all the governments that work in CAMLR. And then we also created all these really beautiful policy reports to help people, again, understand the importance of this place. And again, working in tandem with an international coalition of conservation groups really across the world. As much as I'd like to think our groups are enough to really galvanize the public, folks within our partners work to get celebrity support. So whereas maybe I can get some signatures, this guy in front of you, Leonardo DiCaprio, was able to get millions of signatures in support of protecting Antarctica. And then really galvanizing the public. So this is actually a picture of outside of CAMLR, and CAMLR meets in this pretty obscure stone fortress looking building in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. They meet every October for 2 weeks to make policy decisions. And usually it's a pretty, pretty stoic, serious environment. And as of 2012, the scene outside of CAMLR began to look like this, where the public was out there protesting, holding signs in multiple different languages. You had people in penguin costumes. You had people holding these binoculars, and part of the binoculars was trying to say, we are watching you, CAMLR. We are making decisions that affect the whole world. CAMLR is not open to the public. It's governments who sit together and meet. And so here the public is saying, we're watching you and paying attention to you, even if we can't come inside the room there with you. So a really important moment in this effort to protect the Ross Sea was when there was an event in Washington, D.C. That was put on in part by our partners at the Pew Charitable Trusts and National Geographic. And they were able to get former Secretary of State John Kerry to actually watch a version of The Last Ocean and to get really excited about the Ross Sea. John Kerry, who is, again, our former Secretary of State in the United States, he had a big ocean passion. Like that was part of what he wanted his legacy to be. He was very much leading in the ocean space, not just in the United States, but pushing a global agenda around it. And so when he learned about the Ross Sea, and the United States was one of the main countries supporting the Ross Sea, he wanted to push for it really hard, for it to be part of his legacy during his term. And that proved incredibly important in this room. This is actually finally the room I'm showing you here in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. And you can see all the different governments sitting around the table together. And as I mentioned, now CCAMLR has 27 member states. At this time, they had 25, and they all sit around that decision-making table together. And again, John Kerry proved incredibly important in this room, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So as I mentioned, David Ainley first submitted a paper in 2002. So it took another 8 years, 8 to 10 years for the United States, who worked with New Zealand to develop a proposal for a Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. So it was almost 10 years of scientific effort, producing papers. The United States and New Zealand both led extensive scientific planning efforts to try to decide where the boundaries of the protected area would be. And then it finally came to CCAMLR in 2012. That was the first time a proposal came to the governments for them to negotiate. And for me, after having worked on the toothfish and then worked on this Last Ocean project for so long, I really wanted to be in the room in 2012 when this proposal was coming to the table. And I had just gone back for a PhD to really try to study the policy process at CCAMLR. And so I was able to get a seat in the very back corner of the room. So you can see I'm not sitting around that decision-making table. I'm there in the back, and was able to sit on with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition delegation. And it was this amazing experience where I got to actually watch that process of countries negotiating and understand, how do we get international consensus, international agreement for this very remote but very important protected area. So I like this framework I'm showing in front of you to illustrate how you build to consensus. Again, you need every single country to agree. And usually in this process, you have early leaders, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of the marine protected areas. So at the time, we had these 25 different countries, and the map in front of you, you can keep an eye on that map. It shows you that proposal and how it changes over time as countries negotiate different trade-offs, right? So we have an original proposal, but not every country agrees to it because they have some interests, or maybe it interferes with fishing in some areas. And so we had to do many years of negotiation. So I want to fast forward to 2012 when that first proposal came to the table. And at that time, actually, half of CCAMLR members outright supported that proposal as it was. And so we had these early countries that were Australia, New Zealand, UK, United States, that were funding workshops and funding science. And then we had a series of other countries that just agreed to the proposal straight up. But we had to get everybody to agree, as I mentioned. So if you look at the protected area now, and then here it is in 2013. So if I toggle, you can see again that it actually reduced in size by 40% between that time. And part of that was through negotiations with some really important fishing countries. You can actually see that South Korea was one of those countries, Norway was one of those countries. And part of that was there's a lot of fishing interests for toothfish in the Ross Sea. And so for some countries, some of those northern areas, so again, here's the original proposal, some of those northern areas had a lot of uncertainty, and there's interest in fishing there. So some of those got removed. And through that, though, we were able to get consensus of additional countries, which was amazing. In 2014, we had more countries joining consensus. Over time, more negotiations happening. And that left just China and Russia as the last two countries that were not yet supporting the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. China actually joined in 2015. And again, if you look at that protected area map at the top of the screen, you can see that the protected area got bigger in 2015. And part of that is there was a krill research zone added to the protected area, which China had requested to happen. But stories we also heard from within our colleagues in the State Department, they really attributed some of this to to China, to high-level meetings between our president here in the United States and China's president in 2015, where Obama supposedly was able to get the Ross Sea protected area worked into some of the climate negotiations with China. And again, this ties back to John Kerry worked under Obama and really wanted the protected area to be part of his legacy. And John Kerry's term was going to end in 2016, so he was feeling very urgent about it. So these are the stories we heard, that it actually took presidential level negotiations for us to get China on board with the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. So this takes us to 2016, when CAMLR negotiations were going to resume. Again, they only meet once a year, so you only have one opportunity a year for policy decisions to be made. And in 2016, we potentially had this window of opportunity where Russia was isolated. They were the only country who wasn't agreeing. We had Secretary Kerry's legacy potentially coming to an end. But we also had some other things that provided an opportunity for Russian leadership. In 2016, when this happened, Russia was actually chairing the CAMLR meeting. So they were the ones sort of leading the whole meeting. Russia had a new ecology minister in honor of celebrating a year of ecology in 2017. And at the same time, Russia was also celebrating their 200th anniversary of them first seeing the Antarctic continent. So lots of opportunities for Russian leadership there. So during this 2-week meeting, it was super intense. Negotiations went on until all hours of the night. Those of us in the room were often kicked out, as the diplomats actually held these private headed delegation meetings. And that's when everybody is asked to leave the room except for the top diplomat from each country, and they talk privately among themselves. And so the whole meeting was like that, where we'd be kicked out, we'd be brought back in. And I remember it was 2-week meeting. It was Thursday night of that last week of the meeting. So we didn't have much more time, and they had a head of delegation meeting, and we weren't in. And finally, we all come back into the room, and I'll never forget it. The chair said, "We have consensus, we have agreement for the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area." And in that moment, this room, and you can see it's very serious people in suits, but when that moment of consensus, the room actually exploded in applause. Everybody was clapping, standing, hugging. People from other countries were hugging each other. Some of the scientists were crying. And in that moment, I realized it was like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty at the height of the Cold War. It was this Ross Sea Marine Protected Area was a diplomatic breakthrough. It was a gift to future generations and this amazing environmental win. But again, at the time, tensions were very high between the US and Russia, and we still got this agreement in this moment. So it felt very much like a peace treaty to me. And it was this immediate source of pride for everyone in the room. After its adoption, the CAMLR office actually printed out this map of the protected area and invited all the delegates to come sign the map. And this map is actually still framed in the office of CAMLR today. And if you look closely at the map, it's really beautiful. You can see all these different names on there from all these different countries who again, all came up and were very proud of this moment. So at more than 2 million kilometers squared, and 70% of that is completely off limits to fishing, it is the world's largest marine protected area down here in Antarctica. So looking back on this, I realized this was a while ago. This is 2016. And often, including in my studies now, I try to think about, how did we get consensus on this marine protected area? Like how did that even happen? And really, I think it was that this community of scientists and diplomats and people who engage with the public all working together. So really working across that science policy public interface. And I really can't stress enough, there were hundreds of scientists involved in this effort. There were diplomats from every different CAMLR nation, and there were thousands to millions of public citizens engaged in this. So again, we had conservation groups all over the world, including Korea, really working on this initiative, getting the public engaged and energized, and really working across that interface is what led to us getting consensus on the protected area. And parts of it that I didn't go into detail about, but the trade-offs. So there were a lot of trade-offs between where we could and couldn't fish in the marine protected area, countries having to negotiate that. And over all these years of negotiation, you have individuals building trust, sometimes trust being broken, rebuilt. You had these amazing leaders. I mentioned John Kerry, but there were also other amazing leaders in the room at CAMLAR who worked really hard to get this initiative passed. And that high-level diplomacy that I mentioned that ended up proving incredibly important at the end, especially with China and Russia. So this is actually a map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, again, adopted in 2016. You can also see in the top part of the map, the South Orkney Islands, Southern Shelf MPA up here. That was the first one that was adopted in 2009. We haven't adopted anymore since 2016, and it's not because there haven't been incredible efforts. There have. So there's actually 3 more additional protected areas that are under negotiation at CAMLAR right now. So we have the East Antarctic MPA proposal here in the East Antarctic. We have, we have the Weddell Sea MPA proposal, and we have the Antarctic Peninsula. And if you remember, the Antarctic Peninsula is the area that I mentioned to you that is very stressed from climate change. So having a protected area there is incredibly important. And the Weddell Sea, every trip that goes there, we find new amazing benthic species. It's also an area that has never been fished, so it's an incredibly healthy, robust marine system there. In the East Antarctic, we find more year after year that it's a very important place, especially for flying seabirds and mammals. So, and CAMLAR had originally, in 2002, committed to a whole network, a whole system of protected areas across the Southern Ocean to protect all of its biodiversity. So we very much are lagging behind now, where we made great progress with the Ross Sea, it being very large, but these other protected areas very much need to be adopted as well. And one of the things I should say too, that some countries are trying very hard at is, now that we have this large protected area in the Ross Sea, trying to do active research and monitoring. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if there's questions about that. So current barriers, like why are we not getting these protected areas passed? Well, for one, like everywhere else, it was very difficult during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. These individuals, these diplomats, are used to sitting in a room together and having face-to-face interaction, of having time in the hallways to talk, to get some tea or coffee and talk outside of the room and to make progress. And during COVID, that just wasn't possible. We were having the CAMLAR meeting online, like on Zoom like this, and it was very difficult. People had to meet during all hours of the night to try to accommodate all the time zones across the world. We couldn't meet for very long. People had internet connections. It was incredibly difficult, and you just can't do diplomacy over Zoom. It's too difficult. So that really set us back for a few years. We continue to have conflicting economic interests. As I mentioned, fisheries for krill and toothfish continue to grow. There is more and more pressure to fish the Southern Ocean. And so you have some countries that it's very important for their national interests to keep fishing, and marine protected areas can be seen as a threat to that, where you're closing these large areas of the ocean. So we have to work across that. And you have these geopolitical issues too, where even though Antarctica is a global commons, it belongs to the world, there are countries with historic interests, and those historic interests can sometimes drive the interests today, where Antarctica can still be this place where countries compete for global power, like they do in other venues as well. Perhaps the most important or most difficult aspect of this last year's meeting, so we were there again in October of 2022, and Ukraine and Russia are both members of CAMLAR, and so the tensions over war made negotiations very, very difficult, as you can imagine. So there's been a lot of tensions these last few years that have made progress on things like protected areas incredibly difficult. So I have to say, for me, it does feel like it's become personal. as I mentioned, John dedicated his life, or so much of his life, to the Ross Sea, as did I. And these are our two kids. Adele is my daughter, and she's named for the Adele penguin. And then my son, Orion Ross, who we named for the Ross Sea. And we want so much for them to live in a world thriving with Adele penguins and thriving with Ross seals and all the beautiful life that lives in the Southern Ocean. And really, we know that all of our lives literally depend on a healthy ocean, and that the future of really all of our children of all generations demands that we act quickly to reverse so many of these trends that we've done to the global oceans. And we know protected areas are a very effective tool, as I mentioned, for actually conserving the oceans, including under a changing climate. So I just want to share a story with you before I close, and that is that the threat of climate change in particular, and again, why more and more I think we need to protect more of Antarctica. So Adele's in particular, and again, this is my daughter's namesake, and that's the penguin at the front of the picture in front of you. They are in trouble throughout Antarctica due to climate change. And I've been going to Antarctica for the last 15 years and studying it. And what was really unsettling to me was the last trip I did in 2019. I went to the Antarctic Peninsula, and I hadn't been to that region in about 8 years. And I remember seeing Adele penguins there. And in 2019, we saw very, very few of them, where Adele penguins had abandoned their nests and they had moved on to try to find colder areas, and then other species would take over their nests. So they had almost completely disappeared from some of the regions I was in. And just to elaborate further on the significance of this, is that Adele's actually nest on these, you can see a picture of nesting Adele's, or a little video, I guess, of nesting Adele's in front of you, and you can see the eggs, they're sitting on the eggs. They nest on these ice-free rocky areas throughout Antarctica, and they build nests using pebbles, like little rocks, and they're precious pebbles. They're really hard to find in this icy landscape, and they spend tremendous energy collecting and rearranging these pebbles into nests. So you can see their little pebble nests there. And every nesting season, the Adele's come back to the nest that they built the previous season. And this ritual has been carried out for thousands of years in some colonies. So to witness Adele penguins actually abandoning sites in a matter of years is an incredibly dramatic shift happening really quickly. So Adele penguins, at least in the peninsula area, are moving south, but as the south warms, it's very unclear that they'll have anywhere else to go. And so again, for me, with my daughter's namesake and my last trip, she kept saying, send me a picture of an Adele, Mom. And they were, I was not seeing them. So this is like old news by now, but just to show that Antarctica has been hitting these record high temperatures over the last few summers, and it is very detrimental to the system. So thinking to 2023, this year, so how do we do this year? How do we secure a network of marine protected areas? Well, something really exciting is that CAMLAR did agree to have a special meeting. So as I mentioned, they usually only meet in October once a year, and they meet in Tasmania and Australia, but they've agreed to actually meet in June of this year in Chile, and to have a special meeting where all we talk about is marine protected areas. So we actually work to make progress on negotiating and advancing protected areas. And so that's very exciting. And of course, we need all those lessons that we learned from the Ross Sea. We need to continue high-level diplomacy. We need continued scientific effort. All these amazing conservation organizations that work in Antarctica, and I have their logos at the bottom of the screen for you. And then public support and pressure. I can't underestimate how important that is just to have all of us speak up for Antarctica. It is a place that belongs to all of us and to the world, and to have us speak out in support of it. So just in conclusion, I think I've made really clear that we have increasing human pressures here in Antarctica, but that also it's a place of exceptional governance. It's a place where we can do exceptional things, like the way that we signed the Antarctic Treaty and the way that we protected the Ross Sea Antarctica. So I want to thank you so much for your time and attention, and really excited to have a conversation with you now.
모두 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Thank you.
네, 그럼 이제 Q&A 세션을 갖도록 할 텐데요. 질문 있으신 분들은 지금 채팅룸에다가 질문을 올려주시면 되겠습니다. 먼저 첫 질문을 하자면 영어로 질문이 와서 영어로 진행을 해볼게요. So it seems like Camellar and Antarctic protection is also a very political matter, especially when it comes to conservations. So is there any way we can shift the environmental protection perspective more for the environmental protection rather than a political matter? Um, and also considering that Camellar's decision-making process is based on full consensus. Is there any way we can change it so that not all member states have to agree to making a certain NPA so that it would be much more efficient in protecting environmental protection, in the environment?
Yeah, fantastic questions, and they are related. Actually, the answer is related. So the consensus decision making really is tied to that. I didn't get into it, but there's a whole history in Antarctica of countries planting their flags and staking their claim to the Antarctic continent. So when explorers in the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s were discovering Antarctica, they were mapping it, they were claiming it for their home countries. And so you have 7 different countries that had claimed a piece of Antarctica. And you had Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, the United Kingdom, Norway, and France. You also had the United States and the former USSR reserving their right to claim the whole thing. Classic US and USSR. And so you had that all in place before the treaty was signed. So you have these historic interests and these historic countries that had more power perhaps in Antarctica. And that's where consensus came out of, is that none of those countries wanted to give up their claims, but they basically agreed to disagree. They said, we can suspend the claims for the sake of the Antarctic Treaty and suspend the claims for the sake of not fighting over them. And that was it. Countries were really starting to fight over Antarctica, over those different claims. And so the treaty suspends the claims. They don't necessarily disappear, but countries don't acknowledge them. And we just agree basically to set them aside while the treaty's in place. But that's why consensus matters, because every one of those countries wants to make sure they have power to veto, that they have power to block something from happening, if that makes sense. And so I totally agree, though, and there's been recent editorials. There was an editorial in Nature magazine saying, we can't do consensus anymore, that it's slowing everything down. It's like you have individual countries with their own national agendas then blocking everything from happening. But what I don't know is how you change that, right? You have these legal treaties and conventions that are in place that you would have to basically open up completely to change consensus. And if you open them up, then you might also then open them up to mining or open them up to to military again, you know? So I think it's I totally agree that it would work faster. What I don't know is how we can move away from consensus. In terms of the protected areas being political, it's a really great point. And I think it goes both ways, where some countries are motivated to do protected areas because that's part of their political agenda at home, for sure. And in the case of the Ross Sea, New Zealand and the United States have major science bases in the Ross Sea. So that was an area very important to them, which is why they took leadership there. And then you have also some countries blocking for political reasons too, because if they are fighting with a country or they don't want it. And so I think it's a good question of how do we make that less political? And maybe we do that by more working together. Like the model in CCAMLR has been for individual countries to lead on things. But what we're seeing now in the last couple of years, we now have I think it's 18 different countries that are listed on the marine protected area proposal. So now almost every country of CCAMLR is on these protected area proposals, and it's only a couple countries that aren't. So I think that makes it feel less political, where it's not about a country and their claim and their power. It's like all of us coming together and putting our name on those proposals and supporting them, right? So so yeah, Korea's name is on the East Antarctic proposal and the Weddell Sea proposal now, which is really cool. So
Thank you so much. We're gonna move on to the next question. I'm gonna order the question a bit around so that it goes with the flow well. So there was a question that asked, unlike seas such as the Ross Sea, where the biodiversity is already immense, would it really matter to make MPAs for already pretty much broken down biodiverse environments? So like by making MPAs, would it be possible that biodiversity can reemerge to these areas? Because it seems as if the healthy oceans, like if only by protecting the healthy oceans, spillover might not be enough in order to protect the entire biodiversity. So is there an answer to this question, was one of the questions.
sure. So if I'm hearing that correctly, it's like, even if we protect damaged ocean, is there any value to protecting damaged oceans, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so from previous studies that others have done, there does seem to be incredible value to protecting damaged places. While we do want to, of course, protect healthy places and places still intact, when you protect areas that have been damaged or overfished, you can allow them to recover. And there's some places that recovery can happen pretty quickly, like sometimes within a decade. I mean, I think that's relatively quickly anyways, where the species actually start to recover, including the fish, that they actually can start to come back and start to flourish again. So there definitely are some areas that people are protecting for that reason. Like, let's let it recover. And that is it. It's like anything. It's like a wound. If you leave it alone, right, it will have time to heal. The ocean is the same way. The amazing thing is the environment is incredibly resilient. And so, yeah, just to see that, oh yes, if we just leave it alone for a little bit, it actually will recover and will come back. So I definitely think there's real value to that.
Thank you very much. There was also a question regarding the presentation. This person saw decreasing temperature in part of the Ross Sea, as you mentioned in your previous presentation. So is there any impact of such a climate trend on the marine ecosystem, was what this person asked.
Yeah. So yeah, the map I showed, it tries to give you an average, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And I actually can say in the last couple of years, some scientists are seeing reductions in sea ice and warming temperatures in the Ross Sea. And so that trend that I showed you may be gone. Like, it may be actually turning red now. In terms of the marine ecosystem, yeah, I mean, I think when it was cooling, everything was cooling and you had more ice, and now it's potentially in a system of warming. But the thing about Antarctica is you have a lot of what's known as natural variability, where the environment fluctuates in big extremes over time. And so with those big extremes, it can make it really difficult to see that climate signal clearly. And so that's where scientists are still unpacking it. There's no question that the environment is changing, and there's no question it's due to human-induced climate change, but teasing apart like what is happening naturally and what is happening from climate has been difficult. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's like very, very messy signals right now.
Thank you. So moving on, the same person asked, are there any no-take zones, strongly protected areas in the Antarctic Ocean?
Yeah, definitely. So the map I showed you of existing protected areas, the one in the South Orkney Islands is no take. So it means fully protected, no fishing allowed. And then in the Ross Sea, it's about 70% no take. So most of the protected area is off limits, but there are a couple fishing zones. There's 2 fishing zones where a limited amount of fishing is allowed. But yes, I'd say most of the protected areas in Antarctica are no take. Yeah.
There's also a question about who decides to propose which area as a marine protected area and then in the Antarctic.
Yeah, that's a great question. So far in Antarctica, it's been usually individual countries or group of countries that propose them, and they usually propose them based on their science in the area. So where countries have science bases, they have data, and they can actually get together and propose protected areas. So in the Ross Sea, it was New Zealand and the United States. In the East Antarctic, it was originally Australia and France, but like I said, now we have 18 different countries on there. The Weddell Sea was originally Germany because they had worked there, but now it's 18 different countries. And then the one in the peninsula was Argentina and Chile. And again, they have a lot of science in that area, so they very much led on it.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
So I think because of time, we can have one last question. Professor, can you kind of check your mic because there's this sound? Okay, never mind. Maybe it's on me.
No worries.
I'm not sure if it's only me that can hear. But okay, so the final question is, I think, more connected to what we can do as people outside of the Camila venue. So how can individuals contribute to policy and decision-making processes to protect the ocean? How can we engage more the public in these kinds of matters?
Yeah, great. So again, the question of how do we engage with the public or get the public to engage in the process? Yeah. So a lot of it, at least we found something that was really important was that having beautiful imagery, right? Like trying to recreate for people what it feels like to go to Antarctica, or what it looks like, or why we should care about this place that's so far away. And I think that's a big part of the public piece, just seeing the beauty of the place and appreciating it. But I also think more and more we're learning how important Antarctica is to the functioning of the Earth. Like we're literally, like I said in the beginning of the talk, how much it stores, fresh water, but also that it has for a long time helped store heat and actually store CO2. So it's actually buffered some of the climate change impacts. So I can't emphasize enough, like how much our lives, like if I'm having fires here in Colorado, it actually ties to the warming and melting of Antarctica and the changes that are happening there. So I think the more people can understand how much their lives depend on a healthy Southern Ocean and a healthy oceans in general, but healthy Antarctica and Southern Ocean, that they might care more about this place that's so far away. But as most of you know, it's hard to get people to care about things that aren't connected to their heart, right? So again, the role of storytelling in media, I think, is really powerful.
Thank you. 혹시 이윤자님 마이크 좀 꺼주실 수 있을까요? Okay, so as we have 2 minutes left, unless we have any more questions going on, I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today. And 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다, 여러분.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for your attention tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Cassandra.
Thank you so much. Great to see you, and great to see you all
great to see you.
for listening.
네, 오늘 이제 웨비나 잘 참석을 해주셔서 너무 감사드리고요. 이전에 사전에 공지 드렸던 것처럼 이제 수료증 발급 여부에 따라서 수료증을 아마 2월 초까지 보내드리도록 할 예정이고, 또한 수료증에 대한 안내와 함께 저희 웨비나에 대한 리뷰, 애프터 이제 리뷰를 보내드릴 거니까 그것도 잘 참석을 해주셔서 이후에도 더 좋은 웨비나들을 여러분들에게 제공을 하고 할 수 있게 많은 참여 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 오늘 다시 한번 너무 감사드리고 고생하셨습니다. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. 네. 웨비나 주기 같은 경우에는 이제 보통 2달 정도에 한 번 열리기는 하는데요. 어 매번 조금씩은 다른 해양 이슈로 웨비나를 진행하기 때문에 어 많은 커뮤니티라든가 인스타로 계속 공지를 드릴 예정이니 네. 수시로 확인을 해 주시면 감사드리겠습니다. 또한 저희 인스타에도 공지가 되니까 팔로우를 해 주시면 네. 빠른 정보에 대한 어 네. 빠르게 정보를 받으실 수 있을 것 같습니다. 네. 홍수님